My father was from Messina, but when they had the Diluvio, and they all sort of had to leave there, and he came to stay in Lipari, and that's where he met my mother, in Lipari. Some of my other relatives were already here, so they sponsored for my father, and so he settled here for a few years, and when he made enough money to send for us, he sent for my mother and myself and my sister. My sister was I was about 10, going on 11. My sister was 7, going on 8. And my father had a little fruit shop in Elwood, so we went to live there for quite a while, and we were there for a few years. And then when the war broke out, they in 1939, I think it was, I'm not sure, they sent my father to cut wood, and we were sort of left on our own. Every Saturday night we had to go and report to the police station, and things were very hard. And one of the priests from our church in St James in Brighton used to sort of bring us food and that to keep us going. Oh, well, there was no washing machines or anything. We used to do the washing in the copper, boil the copper and do the washing in the copper, and then just lift it out and put it into the trough and rinse it out that way and hang it. Yeah, no washing machines. Had a scrubbing board. When I was working in the city with a lot of the other young people, and the Italian people used to come, and they didn't speak very well, and they sort of used to make fun of them, and I'd say, well, what are you doing that for? And they said, I said, because I'm an Italian too. And they used to say, oh, but you're different. I don't really know why, but that's what they used to say. Because I've sort of assimilated very well with everybody, yes. A lot of them, didn't even bother to want to learn the language. They just sort of kept with their own people all the time and spoke in their own language all the time, but I was determined that I wanted to learn. I learned by reading books and by speaking to people like I said, they came in the shop and helped me out with the correction of their proper words and that sort of thing. And by reading a lot of books. I used to read a lot. That's how I learned. I've had hard times, when I got married and I had my first child, and we bought this place in Brighton. It was a very big place. And my husband and I, we sent for a lot of the young people from Italy and came and lived with us. And at one time I had about 6 young men. I used to cook for them and wash for them and cut their lunches and all that to get them started. And then they all eventually got married and started their own life. They still respect me when I see them. I've got it in me to sort of help people. In fact, I think after my husband passed away, I was going to do some work in the hospital, but then my sister-in-law got very sick, so I went to look after her instead. Yeah, she was very, very bad for quite a number of years. Well, you say, life was very hard when my husband passed away 30 years ago, because the children were still not very old, and they all had to go through schooling and all that. But I've been very fortunate because my son won a scholarship, so he put himself through schooling, and now he's become a teacher, and they live in Queensland. Him and his wife, they both teach. Very good. They're almost good. Children have had good education. I went back to Italy in 1988. I was in my 60s then. And as I was going into the Lipari there with the boat, I had tears in my eyes. I got so emotional. I never forget the place that I was born. But then what can you do? You've got to make life the best way you can.
My uncles and aunt all lived in North Melbourne, very close to the Victoria Market, and we moved in with my aunt for 1 month, and then Dad found a shop to rent in Victoria Street, and he quickly opened his tailoring business, and we lived at the back of the shop in Victoria Street. I just remember that, of course, we had some help from my aunts and uncles in the speaking of English and so on for Dad, but I quickly became the mouthpiece because children learn to speak English or other languages very, very quickly, and Dad would use me as an interpreter. And anyway, I remember that Dad, after we arrived, started sponsoring some of his old workers from Sicily, and they came to work for us. We were very fortunate. We were very fortunate in that we did have the help from my uncles, and we settled in very quickly and were able to help other people, as I said, by sponsoring them out. There were family friends. My mother's sister and her husband and my grandparents later decided to come out grandparents on my mother's side. They came out by boat a year later, 12 months later. So Mum had all her family here. Dad didn't have anyone. He only had a brother back in Italy. And there was no problems. I remember my uncle was a mechanic. He found work very quickly. We were quite comfortably off. We made friendships. And as I grew older and other migrants started coming in the early 50s, I think, I remember that a lot of people would show up at the shop because Dad had plastered over the Sartoria Italiana in front of his shop. And the ships would come into Princess Pier, but also Victoria Dock, which was now Docklands, I suppose. It's just behind West Melbourne. A lot of people just got off the boat and didn't know where to go, what to do, and they would just walk. And some would finish up in North Melbourne. They'd see Sartoria Italiana. Oh, somebody speaks Italian. Good. So they'd come in and ask for whatever they needed. Where could I find work? Where could I find where to sleep? And my father would say, look, I can't help you now, but if you come back at 5 o'clock, I will take you around. Now, in those days, most people rented out rooms to others. That was the way it was. So even though I was only like 5 or 6 years old, Dad couldn't speak English, and or not well anyway, and he would take me, I was the little mouthpiece, and we'd be door knocking, asking for rooms to rent for these poor people who came off the boat, or giving them whatever advice we could give. Later on, my father always had these ideas. He wanted to import this, he wanted to import that. But when we opened the pasticceria, people would come to us for their wedding cakes or their functions, whatever. So it all came back. The catering business went very well, and he was looking for a picture theatre so that he could convert it into a reception centre. And that's when, I think in 1964, he bought the Adelphi Theatre in Nicholson Street, Carlton. I'd say that at least 70% of the Italians of a middle-aged group met their prospective partners. My mother was fantastic. We used to have up to 10 functions on a Saturday night, and no computers, no nothing, hundreds of workers, and she would organise the whole thing on her own. Fantastic.
I was born in Villasmundo, Provincia Siracusa, which is in Sicily. I came to Australia when I was 11. My father had actually come a year earlier on an assisted program, and I think it was called the Snowy Mountain program. And he was supposed to go and stay at Bonegilla. However, friends helped him, and he didn't actually end up going to Bonegilla, and he did all sorts of jobs, abattoirs, a bit of cleaning, a bit of this, a bit of that. But then he ended up being at General Motors, which took him 2 hours by train. He lived in Brunswick with his family. And he was there for over 25 years. He worked at General Motors. About a year later, he had saved enough money for Mum and my siblings, my sister and my brother, to come out to Australia. And we also lived with his family. We call him Kumpare Miku Zafarano and his family. And I get emotional just thinking of the help that they gave us. We still see them and they're a lovely family. Anyway, about 8 months after, we rented another house and had our own little place, and we were very excited. I have no idea what made my dad come to Australia, except for the fact that he'd been out of work, had 3 children, and he was only in his early 30s. My mother was 27 when she came to Australia, and I was 11, as I said earlier. It would have been a hard life for them. I draw a lot of strength from my mum. I can't imagine how hard it would have been to come to Australia, no family, and she had never worked, and all of a sudden she would have to care for 3 children, find a job, look after a house, and no support. Coming to Australia was a big shock for her, as I said earlier, she just didn't have any backup family. She had lots of friends, and we would go and visit people, and they shared recipes, they shared what was on sale, you could get cheap, what could you do, what could you put in the garden. They would exchange produce from the garden. So I suppose they made their own little community, and we all grew up happily. I don't recall missing anything from Italy. I came here, as I said, I found an abundance of food. We were never hungry in Italy. I can't say I was hungry, but I don't remember getting up from the table thinking, oh, I can't eat another mouthful. But I've had plenty of those in Australia. My life now, I'm married. I married at 21. I married Sam Barbaro. He's also a hairdresser, and we've had quite a few hairdressing salons between us. Done a good job. As a businesswoman, I think I did quite well. We trained a lot of staff. Some have gone on to have their own businesses, which I feel quite proud that they are doing well themselves.
Our family lived in Messina, which was and still is the 3rd largest city in Sicily. At the time, Messina was a very lively port, and full of the excitement of being the closest Sicilian city to the mainland. So the ferries would cross the strait at regular intervals. We would get a lot of visitors. It was the touch place for a lot of tourists coming into Sicily. And of course the experience here in Melbourne was quite different. My father had an opportunity to work at the Globo newspaper as a journalist. And so in the wave of enthusiasm that came about the offer, my parents decided to pack up themselves and their family and travel across to Australia. The very first experience that we had in terms of this great language divide between ourselves and the rest of our neighbours was that my mother desperately needed a colander to strain pasta and didn't know the word. We couldn't spell it in English to find it in the dictionaries. So I remember walking down Sydney Road with Mum and going into a shop that sold the kitchen utensils, and my mother saying, "Pasta, stay, water, go." As a migrant, I look back at the enormous sacrifices that members of our community here faced, but not just here, anywhere else in the world where the Italian diaspora can be found. I think it's one of those things that often is not necessarily read in history books, But people like us who have lived that period of Italian history can testify to the fact that the miracolo economico of the 60s was definitely built on the number of people that left and, in a sense, perform the role of marketers overseas for the made in Italy product. We contribute a level of richness and complexity to this community, to the Australian community, that I think it can only be positive for the future of Australia. And we are really citizens of the world in that sense. I sometimes feel a bit out of place in Italy when I go there, because I feel that I'm very Australian when I'm there, but I'm also feeling very Italian when I'm here. And it causes a certain degree of discomfort at times, a certain degree of agony, because it questions elements of identity and of being. But on the other side of the coin, what richness to be able to live a life like the one that we live, where we become vehicles of so much in so many ways to both cultures. I think the issue of the contribution of women deserves a chapter all of its own in this history of migration. I think they've been the backbone, the spiritual, psychological backbone of migration. A lot that men achieved with their hands, with their labour, with their strength, physical and moral, and with their courage, was matched by what women realised with their patience, their nurturing, their love, their protection of traditional values, and especially the resilience.
My journey as a migrant, I remember quite clearly many different parts of it, but I arrived here as a young baby, actually. I turned 3 on the ship, the Neptune, when we came into port. And my father had already been here 3 years before. He left my mother in Vargonero. I come from Vargonero, which is right in the centre of Sicily, Provincia di Enna. It's an agricultural town, and my father left there in times of hardship. Things were pretty bad after the war, so like many migrants, he came to look for a better future. So he came here, he heard this was the land of prosperity. He came here 3 years earlier before my mother came, and left Mum in Vargonero with her in-laws, 3 young children, my 3 older brothers, and Mum expecting me, so she was pregnant. So the first time my father met me is when I came off the port at Station Pier. I remember the first night we arrived. I do remember, I don't know why I remember, but there was a box that Mum had put blankets in that box, and that's where I slept for the night because there wasn't a bed for me. My uncle had a hairdressing salon in Brighton, and that's how my journey started as a hairdresser, and my trade began. I did 2 years part-time at 14. I went to work for my uncle full-time, and when I was 17 I became fully qualified. I was always a good girl at home. I had my parents, I was too scared to be naughty. I always followed expectations and did what I felt. We were in an Italian community, so we very much stuck with family and the Italian community. I always had a sense of adventure inside me. Even though this thing about being Italian and being born in a different land resonated with me, I was really curious. Where did I come from? Where was I born? Where are my grandparents? I always had this fascination that I wanted to go back and see the place where I was born. So I saved up $830 and I went to Gangitano in Lygon Street, Carlton, and bought a ticket to go to Italy in 1973. My grandparents were so happy to see me, but they never let me out of their sight. So I was indoors most of the time with them. Three days before I was ready to come home after being away for 3 months, 3 days before I left, I met Tony. Gorgeous looking guy with beautiful sparkling blue eyes. Tony and I caught a vision of each other walking down the main street in the piazza. And I'll never forget that moment that our eyes met. 1 year, 2 weeks and 4 days it took before Tony and I would be reunited again. So my father said to I remember the words very clearly. He said, "Why have you come?" And Tony said, "I've come because I really want to get to know your daughter. I'd like the opportunity to get to know her, and hopefully we want to be married." And my father said, "Well, you won't, there's no sampling here. You can't get to know my daughter. You either get married straight away or go home." So with that, we were married within 6 weeks. We were married. Tony and I loved working together. Tony became an excellent hairdresser. We trained a lot of staff. We were quite instrumental within the hairdressing industry. We achieved all the goals that we set out to achieve. I didn't have the opportunity to be formally educated, and it was something that I really wanted to do. So I did a diploma at RMIT. Then I did very well in that, and my teachers encouraged me to go further and apply for a degree at the Victorian College of the Arts, which I did do. My art is informed by my Italian culture. I've been inspired by the strength of women, their resilience, because I know very well I would have never got through all of the things that I did had I not had my background history of my mother being a very strong woman, making do with nothing, working hard. And that's actually what got me through university too, because I wasn't really that fabulous of an artist, but I was very persistent. I would just keep on going until I got it right. I'm just very, I don't let go of something. I'm committed when I want to do it. And now with my art, it's opened the door to a lot of inquiry, and I find myself being more and more interested about my background, more and more interested in the creative abilities and how women reinvent themselves often and their capabilities. And so through my art and through that expression, I'm really interested in promoting our culture, our strengths. And through this art project that I'm doing now, it is honouring our story. It is honouring the women that have had a very strong influence in our lives and where I've drawn inspiration from.
Joy